for joining us for tonight's program on climate change and national security with General Paul Kern, the Honorable John Conger, and Ms. Kate Guy. I'm Claire Noble, the Program Manager for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. We're in our 49th year of providing the Vail community with thought-provoking and affordable programming. A few program notes before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option for Q&A. You can type your questions in there at any time, and we'll get to those throughout the program. Tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It's being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to take a moment to thank the organizations and individuals who helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. The winter season was underwritten by Jeannie and Dale Mosier. Underwriting the geopolitical series is Cindy Ingalls. The environmental awareness series is underwritten by Holly and Buck Elliott, and tonight's program is underwritten by Betsy and Jesse Fink. The Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation, and funding has also been provided to the Vail Symposium by Colorado Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the CARES Act. If you're a Vail Symposium donor, thank you. If you're not a donor but would like to ensure that the Vail Symposium is able to continue offering quality programming, please visit vailsymposium.org to donate. I hope you'll make plans to join us after the holidays on Thursday, January 7th at 6 p.m. when we welcome former Yale President, Dr. Rick Levin, current Penn State President, Dr. Eric Barron, and moderator, Dr. Catherine Reggio of Colorado Mountain College, as they discuss the future of higher education. Tonight, we turn our attention to climate change and national security. We promoted this program as part of our geopolitical series and our environmental awareness series, as we felt it straddled both subject areas. It's an aspect of environmental awareness that we've wanted to address from some time, ever since the idea was hatched on Holly and Buck Elliott's deck more than a year ago. Our distinguished panelists include General Paul Kern, U.S. Army retired. He's a senior counselor with the Cohen Group, and he served as president and chief operating officer of AM General, and is currently a director with LGS Innovations and a member of the Covant Board of Managers. Since retiring from the Army in 2005, he's held the Class of 1950 Chair for Advanced Technology at West Point, was a vice president for Battelle and a director on the Antheon, ITI, EDO, Exelis, and iRobot Corporation boards. General Kern graduated from West Point in 1967 with a Bachelor of Science degree. He holds master's degrees in civil and mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan and was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 2006. He was a National Security Fellow at the J.F. Kennedy School, Harvard University, and is currently a member of the Defense Science Board. The Honorable John Conger is Director of the Center for Climate and Security and Chair of the Climate and Security Advisory Group. He is also Senior U.S. Advisor to the International Military Council on Climate and Security. He served as the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense at the U.S. Department of Defense. He served for 12 years on legislative staffs in the U.S. Congress, including as professional staff for the House International Relations Committee. He holds a BS and an MS in Aeronautics and Astronautics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and an MA in Science, Technology, and Public Policy from the George Washington University. Kate Guy is a Senior Research Fellow with the Center for Climate and Security and a Deputy Director of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She's currently pursuing a PhD in International Relations at the University of Oxford. In addition to her studies, Guy also works as a research assistant to the Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and is a manager of the Oxford School of Climate Change. She most recently worked in American politics and policy as the Senior Policy Program Manager with the Truman National Security Project, and as an assistant to the campaign manager of Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential race. She earned her master's and bachelor's degrees from Columbia University, specializing in international affairs and global environmental policy. Welcome to all of our panelists this evening. And I'd like to start with a question really for all of our panelists tonight. And what I'd like to know is how they came to be involved with this nexus of national security and climate change. And I think we'll start with General Kern and ask each of our panelists to answer this question. General?
Thank you. A terribly interesting question. When I retired at the end of 2004, and the first thing I was asked in 2005 is, would I join a committee of the Center for Naval Analysis, CNA, studying climate change and national security? And the first question that all of us, and they were Army, Navy, Air Force, service chiefs, field commanders, people who had primarily operational backgrounds, asked why. And the question, as we looked at it, is one that we as custodians of the environment which we operated in, which people kind of forget that we do take very good care of our institutional part of that, whether it be desert or whether it be the folks that we operate in the pine forest or the swamps. We do deal with environment and the climate in every aspect. So as we looked at that question, we said, you know, we're not experts in climate change from a science perspective, but we can look at it from an operational perspective and how it impacts our ability to train and execute our operations. And that began a conversation which lasted for some years. I ended up chairing that after a few years and looking at it from a very serious perspective of why would we want to get the Department of Defense involved in climate change as opposed to national security?
John?
Well, in about 2009, I joined the Obama administration as the Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Installations and Environment. It was basically, I was the deputy in the office that ran DoD's installation portfolio. And one of the things that we had to do, I mean, we sort of oversee bases, and we would oversee environmental policy and some of the energy policy. But climate change was in the portfolio. And so we started talking about emissions targets and things like that. And it wasn't through enthusiasm or anything along those lines. This was just part of the job, and the administration wanted to pursue these things. What I found was that over time, the more important conversation that we were having, and I was doing this for several years inside the Pentagon, one of the more important conversations we were having is not necessarily about emissions, but rather about how climate change was affecting the military mission. And so we did a lot more on resilience and adaptation and how we can protect missions from the impacts of climate change and how we can anticipate what missions would have to do because of climate change. And that was certainly an area that we spent a lot of time on. And once I left the Pentagon, I joined the Center for Climate and Security and have been working this certainly more centrally since then.
Great. And Kate, how did you come to study this particular aspect of climate change?
Sure, yeah, I think first, thank you so much, Claire, and really, really lovely to be with everybody. I wish we were there in person with you in Vail, which sounds probably snowy and very picturesque holiday scene right now instead of where I am in DC. But
it's the perfect place to be this time of year.
Hopefully sometime in the future. But no, I honestly think I come at this from a bit of a different background than John and General Kern, in which I actually was always really interested in climate change and always wanted to work on that issue. I did so originally at the United Nations alongside America's diplomats that were working to negotiate the Paris Climate Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals. and was really proud of my work in that process, especially when you got to see America's diplomats really leading the world and being in a position in which we were tackling one of the biggest challenges facing the world and trying to rally other countries to work with us and go further. But I got increasingly concerned sort of doing that work that, you know, we're constantly building institutions at the global level, building these spaces where allies can work together. But what we weren't really paying attention to were the climate impacts that were already starting and the climate impacts that we know are sort of in our future if we continue down this path that we're currently going down. And so researching that question and working on that question at the State Department, now sort of in my PhD at Oxford, I increasingly started looking at, you know, the geopolitical consequences, how America's adversaries might take advantage of these really bad shocks. And that's a security problem, right? That means that Americans might be unsafe because of climate change, and American interests abroad might be threatened because of just the changes that will happen because of the Earth warming. So was very lucky to find John and the good people at the Center for Climate and Security, where they sort of gave me a great platform to do this research and do this work. And from my perspective, I think it's absolutely a defense issue, but it's a diplomatic issue as well and a development issue as well. And it really speaks to the core of American interests and America's role in the world beyond any issue that I can really think about.
Thank you. And I would like to shout out to the organization that both you and John are affiliated with. If anybody is interested, you can find them online at climateandsecurity.org. And if you click on the publications tab, there's all kinds of incredible documents there. And Kate, I know you were really instrumental in some of those documents that have come out earlier this year, the security threat assessment of global climate change in particular. And those are really comprehensive looks at this subject. But I would like to take a step back, and General Kern, I'd like to direct this question to you, and that is, you know, when did the military recognize that this was a threat, that this was something that had to be reckoned with and planned for?
I think the first time we can officially say that was probably around 2005 and 6. And we got both the intelligence community, both inside defense and outside defense, looking at it. And what we saw were the impacts of in many different environments. One, we went to Europe and we asked why the Europeans were taking it more seriously than we were. And we looked at the migration that was taking place out of North Africa into Europe. And so the Europeans saw a population, a demographic change that was taking place. And the cause of it was the expansion of the Sahara, and it became uninhabitable for many of the people that were living in that region. So that was one of the aspects. Then we looked at it from the perspective of where we have to operate and the impact of climate change on our environment. So whether it was in expanding deserts or whether it was in these severe storms that we could see that were impacting our current operations, whether it was rising sea that was impacting our installations. And you started looking at the demographics and geographics of that. And many of our major installations around the world are located on the coasts. And so we saw the impact then on airfields that were flooding and probabilities of people getting to work because of flooding, challenging them. We saw the environment of storms that were increasing in ferocity and velocity, fires that were taking place that the Defense Department was called upon to act, whether it was Air Force folks that were dumping fire retardants on the fires or whether it was Army people on the ground working with local firefighters. So there were major impacts on our ability to train and operate around the world that we were looking at. And we saw this then as something that was not directly a threat, but indirectly a threat that was increasing the probability that would make our jobs harder in the future, and some of it right now. So those impacts then were the parts that were rolled into the defense security environment. And we said, we are not going to be the scientists that can fight the causes, but we have to mitigate these in terms of what we are going to be able to do to work around them or through them. And they were worldwide. And so our issues became ones that we had to look at from that environment in a worldwide perspective.
John, climate change has been called, in terms of national security, a threat multiplier. I think General Kern was starting to touch on that. I'm wondering if you could explain that term and provide some examples of what's meant by that.
Sure. So when the military talks, there's a term that's been around for a long time called force multiplier. And what that means generally is that if you have intelligence capabilities or you have communications capabilities, you can multiply the effectiveness of your force. The group that you have has an impact well beyond their size when you have these sort of multipliers. Well, what we found was that climate change, in direct contrast, acts as a threat multiplier. When bad things are happening in a particular location and you add climate stress to that mix, it makes things worse. And so when you have tensions and you add food insecurity or water scarcity, you force movements of peoples, that accelerates, or it accelerates the instability. It makes things just harder to deal with. And so it may not be the straw that breaks the camel's back in the end, but it's certainly one of those straws. It's not often the direct cause of a conflict, but it adds to that toxic mix.
Kate?
I could just add one thing. I would attribute that to General Sullivan, former Chief of Staff of the Army, who put that label of threat multiplier on the climate change impact.
Thank you, sir. Kate, General Kern mentioned the movement of people out of Northern Africa due to the expansion of the Sahara. Are you seeing, or in your research, other areas of the world that are vulnerable to loss of population? And what are those areas and where are those people going?
Definitely. Yeah. So one of the biggest things that you need to do when you start thinking about climate change and security is, exactly as John said, see places that are already vulnerable, already facing conflicts, in the midst of conflicts, or have recent legacies of them, and say, what happens when you sort of literally turn that dial up a little bit and amplify those existing threats, which John talked about. And I think what we very quickly see when you look at the world is many places that are actually very vulnerable to climate change right now. That's the Sahel and Northern African region, Central America, anywhere that's really equatorial, are unfortunately the most vulnerable to climate change as it sort of comes online in the next few years. So it's just a sort of terrible situation of fate that people in these regions, and I'll also say, legacies of colonialism and bad conflicts in those regions before, that mean that they are going to be some of the hardest hit at present. And as you mentioned, people, it's an adaptation. If you're in a region where you lose your livelihood because of drought, you're no longer able, you lose your home because of a bad flood. Anyone here on this call would say, many people out in California have said, I need to move, I need to get myself and my family to safer ground, to a safer place. Migrating is actually an adaptation. A good response. And so what we're seeing around the world is actually most people don't want to leave their home and don't want to leave where they're from. So they'll go somewhere nearby. They'll go from a rural area into a city, into an urban area where there hopefully are jobs and hopefully are opportunities. If that city cannot support them, if that city does not accept them in a good way, doesn't have the ability to accept them, then they'll start looking to nearby countries, nearby regions, and only sort of down the line when things get so bad that they're sort of forced to go further afield, do they start migrating maybe intercontinentally or to different regions. So it's a much longer term and more complex process than I think it's often shown. But one thing I really want to point out is, I think, in the European case and in other cases, what really made it a security risk to have many people moving and migrating to new areas was not just the fact that they were moving, but really, frankly, how they were treated when they arrived. So if it becomes a divisive thing that becomes quite politicized, if people respond sort of with ethno-nationalist responses or don't take people in, that's when it can become a negative security risk, in that it weakens the cohesiveness and stability of the country. And as I said, this is not something that's just sort of plaguing vulnerable parts of the world, but it's plaguing California, our East Coast, our West Coast, places anywhere that is facing big risks, which unfortunately is many, many parts of the world.
When you were developing the security threat assessment, I'm curious as to whether or not you looked at countries specifically, and in particular, adversarial countries like Russia and China. I feel like I'm trying to engage in a little bit of schadenfreude, but are they going to be hurt by climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it really is at the heart of a lot of my research. What are those geopolitical sort of implications? So the security threat assessment, which Claire references, I'll put a link to it in the chat. It's also on my Twitter, the sort of pinned tweet there. It looks at every region of the world, sort of broken up into the combatant commands that our U.S. military uses around the world, and says, what impacts will this region face in the next 20 years, and then in the 50 years sort of beyond that too, if we continue on these warming trajectories. So if you want some dystopian, horrible, scary reading to go along with your holiday this year, I would recommend it, and you can put it under your pillow at night. But to your question about sort of how are people affected, when we went into the report, John and the other great security scholars that helped us on this effort, we were sort of looking for those winners and losers, right? Who benefits and who really has big losses. But at the end of the day, what we found, sort of exiting and looking back at the project, was in certain scenarios of climate change, everyone is a loser. You know, Russia, you would think that it's quite far north, they can take advantage of maybe the warming for longer growing seasons, things like that. But the world is so interconnected. Supply chains, global economies are so interconnected, and the impacts of warming, especially this rapidly, on circulation systems, on permafrost in the far north, many of these things mean that every country, whether how big it is, how rich it is, how quote unquote adapted it is, will face very dire impacts. And that was actually something that as security experts, we weren't really expecting to see. But it's a big takeaway message for all of us, especially those of us, you know, I'm from Minnesota, so also in the Midwest. You would think that a cold place like Minnesota would be benefiting from something like climate change. But frankly, the downsides, the costs on the other side of the ledger are so great that it's always almost a bad case scenario, no matter what country you are.
Okay, so we have it making bad things worse. We have it perhaps causing people to leave from the rural areas to the cities, and then perhaps leaving their countries. And this next question I'll direct to John, but General Kern might also have some thoughts on this. As a result of this, what new missions or requirements are going to be placed upon the Department of Defense? And John, I know when you were undersecretary, you were the money guy, you were in a comptroller. And so I'm just wondering if the military has the money in their budget to meet these missions and requirements.
So I'm not sure that at this point in time, we're talking about a huge financial issue, and there are financial parts of this, and we can get into that in a minute. But I think as you think about the mission evolving, there's a few things, right? So climate change contributed to the Syrian civil war. It wasn't the only thing that was in that mix, but when you've got hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Iraq war inside Syria, and then you have a record drought that lasts several years that drives hundreds of thousands of people from rural areas to urban areas, you get a lot of unemployed people in Damascus and so on. And so that creates instability, and that created the seeds for the civil war. So we've got folks there now, fewer than before, but we still have people in Syria. And so that dynamic is relevant. So conflicts that we might have to get engaged in. I think there's certainly going to be increasing disasters, whether they are bigger disasters or more. We're going to have to go and provide relief, or at least we'll be asked to do that. And at some point, it's going to be too much for us. And we're going to have to start saying no, which is its own challenge that we'll have at some point. But right now, the U.S. And the military does humanitarian assistance and disaster response on a regular basis. I think looking to the north, you mentioned the Arctic, where the Navy's going to have a whole new ocean to patrol as the ice recedes. And it doesn't take a science degree to see that the ice is receding. The Russians are responding to it, and it's our choice whether to respond or not. But right now, we have maybe one working heavy icebreaker. The Chinese have way more than we do, and the Russians have way more than them. So they're all ready and prepared to operate in that region, and we are less so. And so we might want to be thinking about that. There's a lot of questions that one wants to ask oneself about this. If you want to talk about fiscal impacts, I think that the biggest near-term fiscal impact, and I think this was the wake-up call for Congress, is when we had repeated disasters, extreme weather disasters that had fiscal impacts on our bases. We've paid we've paid well over $10 billion in disaster response in recent years. And so that, Congress, can spend millions of dollars on this, that, and the other thing, but you start talking billions and you get over 10 billion, that's real money. And so it started to think, okay, well, maybe we ought to be building things in more resilient ways. Maybe we ought to be thinking about ways that we can avoid future costs. That's going to be part of it as well.
General Kern, would you specifically address the Arctic operational environment, and in particular, Russian aggression in that region?
Sure. I happen to be doing a study on that for the Defense Science Board right now, which includes some of that, which hopefully you will see coming out in the next few months. But the Arctic is a particularly interesting region, which we tend to not pay much attention to since the end of the Cold War. So we had a DEW line, the distant early warning line, that spanned Canada and into the parts of Alaska out into the Aleutians. And that, after the end of the Cold War in around 1990, we stopped putting big investments into that. So those were radars and communications and other capabilities. So that's one aspect of it. And as the DEW line facilities that were primarily radar stations and communications in Canada, you had to get through the tundra to get to them. The tundra started melting, and that created a great problem, just the opposite of what most people think. These were not big organizations. They might be 40 or 50 people in a village. The fuel to run those operations was basically oil, and it came across ice bridges across the tundra. When that tundra started melting, they then had to be barged in when they could get into it from the sea. More expensive, harder to do, and in some cases, not even possible. That's one aspect of it. How do we rebuild that capability now that the tundra is melting and we have to figure out how to rebuild that capability? Then you look at Alaska and our capabilities there, where we do a lot of our cold weather testing. But most of our equipment that we're using today, particularly for the ground forces, was developed in the 1970s and 80s and was designed for the European environment. We look at our ships that are designed for blue water operations. If you look at anything that is designed to go through ice, it does not have a very sharp bow, which you really don't need you need the opposite to get through the ice. So whether it's an icebreaker, which you mentioned, and the Russians, and you can debate the number, but they have roughly 41 icebreakers right now, 6 of them nuclear, that are polar class that can operate in the deep ice. They've created a command, an Arctic command, which spans their whole region, which is the largest part of it. They've started telling folks that they're going to start charging them for passage through there on tariffs. And so it's an economic factor as well as it is. They explore for oil in the regions, which they didn't do very well. We knew how to do. And as we move all through these things, you look at where the two ends of it are constrained. One is where the Russians emerge, and one is where we have the far end of it in the east, up in Alaska. And so how do we rebuild our capabilities in those regions, and what are the limitations we have to deal with? Equipment, personnel, training, exercising, and dealing with our allies. How do we build the coalitions that we need? Because it's clearly not the US, it's the Europeans, it's Canada, and it's the Pacific that people forget. The Chinese do not have a big Arctic presence, but they're going to make as much of it as they can. And so all of those factors play into a piece of, we like to call gray warfare that's going on today that we don't pay much attention to, which is dealing with the economics of it. And you look at the lines, the commercial lines, which are starting to look at the Arctic and how do we get through it. You look at our one icebreaker and whether we have 2, 3, or 4, doesn't compare to what the Chinese and the Russians are doing. So there are multiple factors on how we exercise, develop our equipment, train our people, deal with the environment, and work with our allies in creating an Arctic security environment, which we've let lapse.
General Kern, earlier this year, you joined the USA Rare Earth Board of Directors. And in the announcement, you cited the need for a supply chain independent of China. And we've certainly seen that as the pandemic has borne out the difficulty when PPE, for instance, had been largely outsourced to China. So also for our audience's edification, you commanded Army Materiel Command. So are there specific supply chain threats posed by climate change? And if so, what can be done about them?
Well, I think people have paid a lot more attention to our supply chains based on COVID more than anything else today. And we've seen how much we depend upon overseas suppliers for materials which we hadn't even thought of, rare earths being one of them. So why are people concerned about rare earths? Because they are into the electronics industry. They're into the motors that we are going to be using for future electronic vehicles. They're into multiple places that you never even thought about, such as the small motors that drive your windows up and down in your car. And the Chinese have cornered the market. Before they challenged the Japanese in the World Trade Organization, but the world saw that was a false accusation, and that was overcome. But now you see them also challenging the Japanese and the islands and all the other aspects of it. So the economics of things like rare earth and access to them around the world, by the way, we have quite a bit in the US, just a matter of getting them environmentally mined and processed, which is what we're doing in new ways, and to take that market away from the Chinese, who are controlling it around the world, not just our market, but it's a world market that they want to control. And before they have consumed almost all that they have, so now that they are actually importing materials for rare earths and doing the processing. So you look at the world economic model, and it depends very much on sea routes of moving goods, particularly large scale goods. And you take all of those pieces together and you say, we must maintain our freedom of operating at the seas so that we can move these goods around, whether they're raw materials or whether they're finished products. And so it's very much tied to our ability to sustain a supply chain that today is worldwide. How much of it can we bring back to the continental United States, or at least to North America? And General Mattis, former Secretary Mattis, and I have been having discussions about how you might want to do that, and looking at it from the Americas to avoid our ability to get constrained about sea routes around the world where we bring these materials in. So that it does significantly impact our ability to operate worldwide.
When you say concern about sea routes, are you also referencing the South China Sea?
Clearly, the island chain, the South China Sea. You can look at all the choke points around the world where everything has to pass. And the South China Sea is a major conduit for worldwide commercial traffic, as well as for military operations. And so maintaining our ability to operate there is important, and maintaining our ability to have the capabilities to operate there. And candidly, we need to increase our capabilities and work it with our allies in a much better operational sense, so that we can maintain those sea routes 365 days a year without question.
John, we've talked about how climate change is impacting infrastructure, for instance, flooding of naval facilities, for instance, but it also impacts, I understand, readiness and training. Could you address that and perhaps provide some examples?
Sure. In the simplest construct, there's going to be flooding, there's droughts, there's wildfires, and these affect training ranges just as they would affect anywhere else. That affects how much those training ranges can bear, how much training you can do on them. They affect endangered species. We are actually fairly good at taking care of the endangered species on our bases. There are more endangered species on DoD bases than there are what, 800 different endangered and threatened species on our bases, and there's some that are only found on DoD bases. The point being is that when the climate changes, it affects those too, and so we have to be cognizant. I think that one of the readiness dynamics that we're going to have to be dealing with in the coming years is the fact that when you have a training range with over 90 degrees, when the temperature goes over 90 degrees, they call it Black Flag Day. Well, in the Southeast, where a lot of our training bases are, you're going to have more and more of these 90-degree days. You're going to go up from 30 days a year to 100 days a year where you're having Black Flag Days, and that's going to affect your ability to get through a training syllabus because people aren't going to be able to go outside. Those dynamics are all relevant and part of the mix. I think every time somebody has to respond to a disaster, that affects readiness. I mean, look, the test and training range near Eglin or near Tyndall Air Force Base was certainly affected when Tyndall Air Force Base got hit by Hurricane Michael and was out of commission for a month. That affects training. When Camp Lejeune got hit by Hurricane Florence, that affects training. So those dynamics are all, it's not just the extreme weather, but it's certainly part of it as well.
I think I saw an interview with you when you were addressing permafrost and the issue in Alaska with permafrost starting to melt and affecting some of the bases there.
Yeah, so when you don't build your buildings right in a permafrost area, and then the permafrost thaws, that can crack a foundation and make a building unsafe. And when you have munitions in those buildings, that is particularly unsafe when the building isn't stable. You don't want any people anywhere near there. And so there was a recent case at Eielson Air Force Base where the permafrost thawed, the building hadn't been constructed properly, and an F-35 munitions facility was therefore unusable, uninhabitable, and they had to replace the building. And that cost $15-16 million. And so does it happen every day? No, it doesn't happen every day, but it's something they have to pay attention to, and they have to make sure that the buildings they do build take into account the fact that the permafrost is gonna eventually thaw, and that they're gonna have to maintain stability of the foundation. And
correct me if I'm wrong, but the F-35 isn't a really old. I mean, we're not talking about something like a C-130 or a B-52. This is a relatively more recent acquisition. So it seems like these would be more recent vintage buildings.
Yeah, no, you definitely, buildings get repurposed. Let's not dance around that either. But the fact of the matter is some are in better shape than others, and some are in better locations than others. It's just something where we've been working on changing the building codes so that they have to take this kind of thing into account. And I'll give you another example. And I know you were talking about permafrost, but I'm going to go off to floodplains. There was a recent congressional regulation that in a floodplain you have to build the building so that the ground floor is 2 feet above flood level, 100-year flood level. And we were wrestling with this when I was in the Pentagon, and I asked my team. So I had the expert in military construction who worked for me, and I asked them. I said, "So what cost does it impact us? How much more is the building going to cost if we take the step of building it a little bit higher if we're in a flood zone?" And he said about 1%. That's about how much more the extra cost is going to be. And at which point you realize that if I'm going to have to build it in a flood zone, and some buildings have to be in particular locations, you want to take the safety measure. You want to have the building code such that you're protecting yourself and minimizing damage. The same thing is going to be true in permafrost.
Well, since the issue of permafrost came up, I have one of my from left field questions. And Kate, I'm going to spring this one on you. In 2016, something really weird happened. Siberia experienced an unprecedented heat wave, and subsequently, a number of people became ill, and some died from what was later identified as anthrax. What had happened was some reindeer had been encased in that permafrost since 1941. They thawed during that heat wave and released anthrax spores. And I know typically the military focuses on biological threats that have been weaponized, But I'm wondering if in your research you came across any effort to consider the national security impacts of diseases that emerge from climate change.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question, and it is a very weird and scary phenomenon of such that are happening all around the world with climate change. You know, that heat wave that you mentioned in Siberia happened again last year. We all saw when temperatures in the Arctic were quite balmy for the summer and winter months. So specifically around health risks and climate change, there is a ton of really good quality medical research going into this. And the fact is that climate change is going to have very disastrous health impacts around the world. Vector-based diseases like malaria, water-borne diseases like cholera, infectious diseases like the ones we're seeing now, and as well as just the very intense impacts of heat stress, especially on older populations, especially in places without good cooling and air conditioning, are going to be extreme. And this is probably, quite frankly, where most people are going to feel the impacts of climate change, not to mention air pollution and smog and all the other things that go along with these emissions. So it's one of those intersections that if you're looking at how climate change affects a whole suite of issues that make us unsafe, health is right at the top and something that we should all be really concerned about. But I like to think about this in another way too, which I think we used to talk about, and it's only in this moment of a unforeseen global pandemic that it really becomes clear. But much like health risks, climate change risks don't know borders. They don't recognize, they're not an actor-based threat, right? You can't go attack a person who is perpetuating this against you. And they really require the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the White House, our entire security infrastructure to think about threats in a very different way. These are strategic risks. They are systemic risks that could take down whole systems in the matter of weeks. And much like climate change, these biological security threats interact with other risks in really important and really dangerous ways. So if we're not really thinking about these types of risks from a security perspective, we are leaving our populations unsafe. You know, it's not just what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening with China that deserves our money and our best and brightest focusing on them. We need to be thinking about these maybe slower burning, longer term, but much more dangerous risks, because those are the ones that are really affecting our suburbs, right? Those are the ones that are affecting our homes and our livelihoods and our jobs. It's not a risk somewhere else in the world. And so I'm inspired by some rhetoric early from the incoming Biden administration that wants to really reorient security around these risks in response to the coronavirus pandemic, but also in response to what they see happening with climate change across the world.
Can I add just a thought to that too? Which is it's also very predictable. I mean, Kate brought up the pandemic, and the intelligence community has been warning there was a pandemic coming, and they didn't know exactly what year it would come, but they knew it was coming, and we had to be ready for it for many, many years. And similarly, climate change they've been warning that climate threats are coming, and they're going to affect stability globally. For many, many years, since the Bush administration. The worldwide threat, and you can look back at the old worldwide threat assessments that the intelligence community puts out since back then, and they've been saying, you know, this is one of those things that's very predictable that we know is coming, is going to have these impacts, and is going to affect the threat environment.
If I could just add a couple of points. You know, the Department of Defense has been dealing with this for literally centuries, whether it was yellow fever, malaria, digging the canals, and we operate in environments which we don't control. And so as they change and release these things, like you saw the anthrax, that's something that we have to learn how to deal with and provide the protection to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines who have to operate in those areas. And we have to learn how to operate through them. We often find that the health risk of where we're operating is as big a threat as the people shooting at us. And so we have to learn how to deal with it, whether it's in Siberia, for anthrax, which we hope we don't ever have to go fight in, but wherever else we're going to find it around the world. And so as these things emerge, we have a good deal of our defense medical community that continuously is researching these capabilities and researching how we can prevent them. And what you haven't really seen is how much they were involved in all these vaccine developments that have been going on. And you definitely see it in the distribution of them right now, because that's one of the big strengths of the Defense Department is how do you how do you deal with large scale events over broad distances? And we have both the transportation and the capability to integrate all of those capabilities. So those are things that we deal with on a regular basis. I could also go back to just to firefighting. Every year, we devote a portion of our armed forces on a ready basis to go help fight fires. And it's growing. And so whether they're in the middle of a pandemic or not, they're going to have to deal with fighting the fires in California or wherever else they emerge. I can remember one event back in the greatest buildup in the Iraq wars, where we had large scale deployments, and we had East Coast units that were ready to deploy to the West Coast because that's where the deployed forces were coming from to fight fires. So it has multiple impacts on our ability to sustain and train a force, and on our medical conditions that we have to be prepared to deal with worldwide.
General Kern, I wanted to go back to something that you had mentioned earlier about how in the initial period where the Department of Defense was starting to look at climate change and planning for climate change, you went and looked at what the Europeans were doing. I'm wondering if since then you've expanded that and to look at what other countries, and again, particularly our adversaries, are doing.
Yes, we do. I mean, we are in a continual process of evaluating our strengths and weaknesses, as well as our adversaries. So as they prepare to deal with things, we watch that very carefully. I would sometimes wish that we have more opportunities to do that, because we really stretch both our intelligence collection worldwide is pretty thin when you try to get into all of the capabilities that people are developing. We look at emerging threats, and so we've been very focused on terrorist threats over the last 20 years, as opposed to national threats, which we've only regained our look at as we look at China and Russia's ascendancy in the world and our ability to deal with them. So we look how they're equipped. We looked how they train their people and how they deal with them. I noted earlier that the Russians created an Arctic command. They're also training up there, and we look at the equipment that they use and how they prepare to deal with the cold weather. A lot of people may not be paying much attention to right now, but this standoff between India and China, which we're watching very carefully, is in very high cold altitudes. And the Chinese have moved a lot of equipment in there to deal with that in an environment which they weren't prepared to deal with. And so those kinds of things are evidence of how we have to watch and prepare ourselves to be able to deal, whether it's extreme cold, extreme hot, extreme dry, extreme wet. So we change our clothing, we change our equipment, we change the medical conditions of how we prepare people and train people.
I'm going to take, I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I was just gonna, the General Kern mentioned the tension between India and China, and I think that's an important thing not to let go and to focus on for just an extra minute, because you have tension between India and Pakistan that's been there for a long time, and most people don't realize that India controls all of the fresh water that goes to Pakistan. All of it starts in India because all the Himalayas and the glaciers and the water sources, they start up there, and so you have tension there. And during some of the high tension points, India sort of slows the flow of water into Pakistan, which they rely on to live. Well, frankly, China has taken steps to control a lot of the water sources for the rivers that could flow through China in that region. So as you have these three nuclear powers sort of facing off against each other, what are they most interested in is water, because of the increasing scarcity that we see coming forward. I think that's just, climate change is only going to exacerbate all of those tensions, and that's something we have to keep a very close eye on.
John, this question comes from an audience member. Douglas is asking, what are your thoughts on the role of DARPA in playing a leading role for the DoD and taking point on developing cutting-edge green technologies and then their transfer to the commercial market? So
the DoD, when they do R&D, it's usually focused for a military purpose, right? So let's start with they're looking to advance technologies that are in the DoD mission interest. That said, there are plenty of things that can spin off from that, and certainly there are mandates that get imposed on DoD to say, okay, well, stop using the firefighting foam that you're using because it's poisoning everybody around you. So invent a green version of that. So things like that do happen, and things like that are funded with defense R&D. I would be careful about using DoD as the source for primary R&D for inventing green technologies when it might be the mission of the Department of Energy, for example, to do some of those things. So DoD will do parts of it, no question. But there are other federal agencies that when a technology development effort is in their lane and is their mission, they're more likely to be the ones that pursue the technology. But the DoD will play a role.
I could just add two comments. The Corps of Engineers does a lot of green work technology. And so the lead, which they, and it's a combination of DOE and the Environmental Protection Agency and the Corps of Engineers all work in those areas. DARPA is designed to do very high risk where most of it's not going to succeed. And so their work could be very long-term in terms of what you're trying to do. And I think in terms of looking for green solutions, we're looking for now solutions, not something that's going to be 10 or 20 years from now.
Thank you for adding that. Kate, this question is for you. And I'm singling you out because in your threat assessment, there's a line that stood out with me, and it said, proposed international agreements are not commensurate with the threat. And Lauren is asking about the Paris Climate Agreement. President-elect Biden has indicated his intention to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. What do you make of this? And how do you think that the Biden administration could make the Paris Agreement more effective?
Absolutely. And I think if they do not, we are facing even worse security futures than we've been talking about today. So I think it's important to look at this from the perspective of, what somebody working on national defense like General Kern and John have been discussing. What they want is the risks to be mitigated, right? They want these big risks that we're talking about of Russia in the Arctic or China in the South China Sea or that water stress in the Himalayan region to be as low as possible. Because when it is high, when those risks are high, that's where these competitive threats and interactions become much more testy. So what we need to do then is make sure that warming doesn't get out of control. We need to limit climate change as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the world is moving in quite the opposite direction. Emissions are still rising with each passing year. Right now, the Earth has warmed about 1 degree centigrade from pre-industrial levels, and that's everything. All the destruction you see in the world today is just at 1 degree. We're on track for 3 or higher by the end of this century, and those numbers might seem small and innocuous, but it's very drastic and very rapid changes that will, as we've said, unseat everything around us. So what the security community is increasingly saying, and it's not something that they say lightly, they like to sort of sit in this space of General Kern and John Conger of, how do we deal with the threats as they are? And they are expert at doing that. But increasingly they're saying, no, what we need to do is make sure this risk is as low as possible, that those warming scenarios are bending the curve the other way, much like coronavirus. You don't want a pandemic spiraling out of control. You don't want climate change spiraling out of control. The only way to do that is for the world to come together and turn around and deploy clean energy, have this rapid clean energy transition and start getting our emissions under check. Right now, the Paris Climate Agreement is the only sort of global agreement we have to do that. Why we say that the Paris Agreement is not enough is because those initial pledges that countries have put forward of how they'll constrain their emissions only get us part of the way, right? As I said, only get us to about 3 degrees warming scenario. We need to keep bending that curve and go further. And it frankly takes the US in a leadership role to do that. The rest of the world is sort of looking to the US for where the global economy is going to go, for where supply chains and markets are going to go. And the rest of the world listens when the US tells them to do something, right? It's President Obama going to China and saying, no, you have to commit to lower your emissions as well. And luckily, I think the team that Biden is bringing with him is poised and ready to do just that, to wield carrots and sticks to make the rest of the world go where we need to go. And hopefully that will be under a US-led global agreement again.
Can I offer a cynical point to agree with Kate? I just want to add, even if you weren't as concerned about Paris and you thought it was going to cost jobs or something along those lines, the Paris Agreement is a voluntary agreement. There's no cost, there's no or else for not making those other than the security futures we're all buying. But removing yourself from the agreement undermines American leadership. And so while it bought us no jobs to remove ourselves from the agreement, because anything we would do to comply with it would have had to pass through Congress and get signed by the president. So, that's the check on this. But what we did was remove ourselves from the table. We removed ourselves from a leadership position, and as a consequence, undermined our national security by letting other actors take those leadership roles and exert influence. And so I think that was truly, even if you were going to be purely cynical about this issue, getting back into Paris is of utmost importance.
Well, we are running low on time. And so I would like to offer each of our speakers the opportunity for some final words. I'm kind of hoping you would also address in those final words whether or not you're optimistic or pessimistic, and if so, why? And so why don't we start with John?
Well, optimistic or pessimistic about what, right? So I tend to be a little realistic and pragmatic. I'm going to tell you this. Based on the emissions we've already put into the atmosphere, we have 20 to 30 years of terrible things that are going to happen, and we're going to have to deal with it. If we want to avoid the even worse things that are going to happen when our kids get to be grown-ups, well, then we're going to have to reduce our emissions today. But we have to get ready for this. And so from a realistic and pragmatic point of view, I think it's absolutely vitally important to prepare for the impacts that are coming over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so I think you just look and you understand that the world is changing and we have to adapt to it if we want to protect our own national security. Am I optimistic? I think people react to disasters. As these disasters continue to manifest themselves, I think people will respond. And so at least I hope so.
General Kern.
I'll start by saying I'm an optimist. I believe in people. I believe that people will eventually come around to doing the right things. Sometimes it's painful to get there, and it takes a lot of leadership to get people moving in that direction, but I am an optimist that we will get there. But for the short term, we are in an area of mitigation. We can't stop what's happening for the next 5 years if we had the most drastic changes in our controls. So we're going to have to deal with that. So whether it's the flooding and the rising waters, whether it's the fires, whether it's the severe storms, we're going to have to learn how to deal with that. And from a national security perspective, I think the Defense Department today is beginning to do that. They're looking at the Arctic, they're looking at sea level rise, they're looking at all of these other missions that they're going to have to be able to conduct and beginning the preparation phases of that. So I'm an optimist that we'll get to the right answer. I'm not an optimist that it's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and we're going to have to deal with the mitigation in the meantime.
Kate, I'll give you the final word.
All right. I don't know how I build on that, except to say, look, the security community is one that lives its life in the worst case scenario, right? And you want them to. You want the Department of Defense, of Homeland Security to be focused on what could go wrong, how things might make us unsafe. And we as normal Americans want to go about our life knowing that somebody is focused on that worst case scenario. But what you've heard tonight, and I think what you'll continue to hear, is that security community saying, hold up here. This worst case scenario is quite bad and quite catastrophic if we don't start changing and shaping our behavior really differently. And I guess the reason, though typically I think I'm often the pessimistic voice in the room, maybe not tonight, but what makes me optimistic is the fact that everything that we've spoken about tonight is not inevitable. This is not the moment to throw up our hands and say, well, the Arctic is gone, the China and India and Pakistan will be fighting against each other in the Himalayas. all of these are decision-based outcomes, right? It's important to look at how things could go terribly wrong and how things could get competitive and antagonistic in these regions, and think through those scenarios, and then do everything you can actively to cooperate, to build diplomatic relationships in those regions, to minimize warming, and to change our societies and behaviors to make sure those outcomes never happen. And so it's important, I think, when you hear this type of information, which sounds quite bad and scary and negative, that you think through, okay, if that's how bad things could get, how do we turn the course beyond that? You know, it's like a train. If it's here and the world ending and completely catastrophic, let's make sure we stop the train just shy of that and get off a few stops before that. And I think that's what the security community is really good at doing, right? Of saying, if we do this, here's what happens. But if we take this alternate course, things could be a lot better. And so there's a lot of smart people looking at this. And hopefully we now finally have, as John and General Kern said, the will that we need politically to get there.
Well, you guys have been great. This hour has flown by. I thank you very much for participating, and especially bringing this aspect of climate change that I don't think a lot of people had been considering or thinking about. I really appreciate it. I wish you all happy holidays. For our audience at home, thank you all for joining us tonight. Happy holidays to you. And I hope you will join us on January 7th, that's a Thursday evening at 6 p.m. when we look at the future of higher education. Thank you all and good night.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. Take care.
Thanks, Kate. Bye-bye.